runner, running in Cape Cod, Massachusetts and beyond. I'm your host, Julianna, and today we have our very first and very special guest, Miss Dr. Nicole Davies. Ooh, she's fancy. Here she is, a doctor, and we're very excited to have Nicole today. And like I said, she is our first guest of the podcast, a friend of the podcast as well too, which is very exciting. So welcome, Nicole.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you here today. Why don't you go ahead and tell our viewers and our listeners who you are and what your background is and why you get to call yourself a doctor. Ooh.
So fancy.
Yeah.
I just finished my doctoral program in sport and performance psychology at the University of Western States in June. So that's why I have the title doctor. But a little bit about my background kind of before that. Mm-hmm. I started as a competitive synchronized figure skater when I was 9 years old. And I moved up the levels in the ranks from then. The end of high school, I was competing for Team USA, traveling abroad. And when I went to college, I kind of stepped back from that to focus on school and do, internships, study abroad, that kind of thing. But really felt as I was approaching college graduation that I wasn't done. I hadn't fulfilled all the goals that I wanted to in skating. And so I actually moved across the country to skate for a team out in Michigan, and was really fortunate to compete at the World Championships then. And in my experience during that time, I was using skills that I had learned on my previous team from a sports psychologist. We were really lucky, which I didn't realize at the time, to have those resources provided. And I continued to use them throughout my career. Yeah. I didn't realize it was something that not every team had or not every athlete was exposed to. Mm-hmm. So that kind of started my interest in it. When I moved back to the East Coast, I started coaching my own teams and working with an organization and just kind of using the tools that I used for myself. I did actually take a sports psychology class in undergrad as well, but just one. So just kind of using some of those skills, working with my athletes that I was coaching on ice. And as I did more of that work, I realized how passionate I was about it and how fulfilling it was, and I wanted to do more of it. But I was working another kind of full-time day job, and that was just kind of like my on the side, staying involved in the skating community. Yeah. And I also started encountering some situations that I wasn't sure how to handle. And so that's when I decided I needed to go back to school.
Was there like one situation that you can think of specifically that was kind of like the breaking point for you, realizing like, oh, I need to address this in the figure skating and also the larger community?
Yeah, great question. There were a couple kind of around the same time, a lot of them related to mental health. And I felt I did not have the credentials to be helping with, whether it was some of my athletes had lost family members and were kind of dealing with grieving and also still continuing to perform and compete, and that's incredibly challenging. Yeah. There's a lot of, disordered eating that's happening in skating as well.
I can only imagine.
And working with that population, females in middle school, high school, there are a lot of kind of social dynamics going on. So I didn't want to do something or say something that was going to harm somebody more. Mm-hmm. So that was why I decided to go back to school, get my degree. And to be clear, I am not a mental health provider. I do mental performance. Mm-hmm. So there's a spectrum of this work. I'm not a licensed psychologist, and I made a choice because I want to focus on the performance side. Yeah. But I do now have the tools and the skills to not to diagnose, but to recognize signs and symptoms and understand when it's necessary to refer somebody to another clinician. So I feel a lot more confident in those skills, and also equipped to do psychological first aid, kind of like on the spot mental health help as needed, just not kind of like long-term treatment in that.
Yeah, which is definitely needed, I would say, in not just figure skating, but like most sports out there. I feel like I didn't even know that sports psychology was like a thing until I started listening to podcasts, honestly, when I was like getting really into running, because I don't come from a background, and our listeners and viewers, if you've listened to the first episode of this podcast, you'll know that I didn't compete in any sports growing up, really. I was in theater and things like that, and the mental health side of theater is questionable at best. You know, there are some troubled humans in the theater world.
Well, that's also a type of performance.
Yeah.
And so the same skills and the same interventions apply, whether you're preparing to perform on stage or on a race course or on an ice rink.
Oh, definitely. And it would have been really nice to have a mental performance coach for the theater shows too. I'm not discounting that in any capacity. That would have been very helpful, especially since theater kids are their own brand of troubled, to put it nicely. But yeah, I just didn't realize that was really even a thing. And the more I've gotten into running, the more I just really appreciate the mental side of things. And I just put out a little mini-sode before this one that's a little pep talk for everyone. And I mentioned in that I believe that running is at least like 70 to 80 to 90% mental, depending on the person. It's like your body will take you as far as it's going to take you, but you got to stay in the game. It's a really big part of sports on the whole. So, but you are kind of specializing in first figure skating. That's your favorite thing. You grew up in that. You competed in that professionally, which is awesome and really cool and way beyond anything I'm ever going to do athletically.
You don't know.
Yeah, but I'm getting, we'll see. But I think that now you're kind of transitioning to a point where you are doing that as your full-time job for the most part. But like you said, it's applicable to all things that are performance-based. And right now you are helping us with the Cape Cod Marathon, which is fantastic.
Yep.
And you're being our psychology's like psyching team. Do you want to speak a little bit more about maybe how you've transitioned from just doing figure skating to now working with runners and other sports, and how that's different potentially, and like maybe some pros and cons of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned I'll be heading the psyching team for the Cape Cod Marathon, and I have a great group of volunteers that will be helping. So we'll be out on the course at the finish line at the expo, providing tips as needed, like I mentioned, psychological first aid if needed, and really there to support runners. How did I transition into this work? Throughout my school process, and even now I am actually studying for my CMPC exam, which is Certified Mental Performance Consultant through the Association for Applied Sports Psychology. Kind of a mouthful. But to fulfill all the requirements for that certification, there's a lot of coursework, which my school program fulfilled. And then you have to do 400 mentored hours of work. And actually, even before that, if I back up farther, this is kind of a fun story. So there's an activity that I like to do with my athletes. And it's kind of getting them to think about how they're motivated and how easy it is for them to meet internal versus external expectations. And I do this activity with some of the teams that I work with. And sometimes it's just a really big hit, and they're talking about it in the car ride home, in their carpool, where their parents are listening and overhearing. So one year I had a parent contact me after this practice to say, wow, this activity, you know, my daughter wouldn't stop talking about it, and I think it'd be great to do with my team at work. And so he brought me on to work with a corporate team. And so with that company, I did a couple of sessions doing this kind of work with them.
Nice.
So that was even before I went back to school and then started my CMPC process. But this past spring, I also did an internship with the Arizona Diamondbacks, professional baseball team out in Arizona for spring training. So I had some experience working with professional baseball players, a totally different demographic population than what I was used to with skaters. And that really reinforced for me that the work is the work, no matter who you're working with. I think I had a lot of maybe fears or anxieties going into that situation of like, can I work with this population? I don't have this experience. I don't know a lot about baseball. And of course there are reasons where knowing the sport really well is helpful, and not knowing it as well, there are places where there are some gaps, and it was a learning experience in that sense for sure. but the mental skills are really the same, and they do apply across all of the sports. Maybe the way that it's applied or when you actually need it is a little bit different. But just as I could probably ramble on this for hours, but if we just take one example, like thinking about your activation level, like your arousal level, when you maybe think about when you're starting a marathon, and how that compares to even when you're mid-marathon or the end of the marathon or in a training cycle. Those points in time are really different. The same thing is true if you play baseball. Maybe you're a pitcher, but maybe you're a starting pitcher, or maybe you're a reliever. So the amount of like activation that you want to have, whether that's your physical body, like your heart rate and that kind of thing, or what kind of thoughts you want going through your head, is going to be different depending on the situation. But the actual skill of recognizing your own activation levels, modifying them as needed, like that skill applies to all of these situations. It's just how do you want to increase your activation? Do you want to decrease? Do you want to keep it the same or neutral? But that applies across all sports.
Yeah, that's so interesting too, because when you're breaking that down in like saying it out loud, I'm breaking it down in my head too, thinking like, oh yeah, you're right, because like you start at the beginning of the marathon and there's a crowd there and they're screaming, and then like with a smaller marathon like versus like a bigger marathon like Cape Cod, like 2 or 3 miles in, the crowds have dwindled to like quite a bit, and you're not getting that external input, and you got to start kicking in that like internal motivation. And kind of one of the things I like to do when I'm running marathons is I chunk them mentally. And so like I know one of the things that I almost always do, it depends on the race too, is like at 13.1 miles at the halfway point, and we're like, okay, mentally I start myself over. Like I get to the halfway point, I'm like, nope, we wipe the slate clean, this is the end, and then we start this track over again. So, but I can see how that would apply to, say, someone who is doing a figure skating competition just in a different format. Like, okay, where's your halfway mental start over point? Where is your, like, the crowd's not screaming for me as much start, like, point where you have to think a little bit more, like, less external, a little bit more internal. So I can see where that would be, like, a really interesting thing to kind of observe for you in different scenarios. And also where it makes it a universal thing that you as a practitioner can take and be like, hey, I might not know baseball that well, but I know brains. And I can help you kind of like get your brain through this situation, which I think is a completely underrated side of like performance in the whole. And I like how we're calling it like performance too, and not just like doing a sport or whatever, because I think it's more obviously a performance in like, say, like figure skating, where it's like, yeah, I'm putting on a show for everybody, look at my performance. Whereas when people step up to, say, the plate or say the starting line of a marathon, you're not necessarily thinking like, oh, I'm putting on a show today. If you're me, you are, because I like doing that. I'm like, wow, here I come, everyone. But that's a solely Julianna issue. But but I think it is a good way to think about like these bigger events that are happening within sport. Do you find that there are some people who have a challenge like kind of framing it as a performance or like seeing it through that way? And like how would you approach someone who is like, yeah, like I'm just doing my thing, but they're still having like a challenge, like doing the thing or whatever they're doing? Like how would you like approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I think language is really interesting, and if somebody doesn't see it as a performance, I would want to kind of understand like how they do see it, and depending what challenge they're facing, probably again like the skills that they're going to need to learn are probably the same.
Yeah.
And I really like the example that you gave about if you're at a race where there's a really big crowd at the start and there's a lot of energy and adrenaline, and you're kind of like really highly activated at the beginning, and then you get a couple miles in and it's less so. But it's also a marathon, right? And you can't probably, unless you're like an Olympic marathoner, maintain like your top, right? Your top activation arousal for the entire race. So knowing, and that's something you'll do through training, is like practicing this. I think blocking is a great strategy. Knowing the course where you're going to be running, and knowing things like you just said about where are there going to be crowds, where is the energy going to pick up based on external factors, and when are you going to need it more internal. And then that would be the kind of skill I work through with a client is how do you elevate your internal? Is it cue words? Is it self-talk? Is it being present in the moment? Is it music? There are so many different types of strategies, and finding kind of like the individualized plan that works for a particular athlete is important.
Yeah, so it's like super individualized, which as someone who has a background in nutrition and dietetics, I'd say one of like the big things you'll find with dietitians is anytime you ask them about anything nutrition based, they'll usually say, it depends, because it does.
Yep.
And I definitely appreciate other healthcare professionals who are out here not giving huge, like, we can give somewhat blanket statements to people, be like, yeah, it's like if you're running, say the Cape Cod Marathon specifically, you will have some crowds here, like maybe planning some strategies that are more internally based when you get further. What I'm going to do is going to be different from what you're going to do, and the next person's going to do, and the next person's going to do, because we're all individual human beings.
Yep.
We all have our own brain chemistry and brain makeup that we're dealing with, and I really appreciate the individualized approach that you take with what you're doing, because it should be. It should be an individualized thing.
There's actually a theory called IZOF, which stands for Individualized Zone of Optimal Functioning.
Oh, okay.
And this is something that I really love because not only is it individualized to the person, but it's looking at a spectrum of feelings, both positive and negative, or maybe pleasant and unpleasant, helpful and unhelpful. So for somebody, maybe anger or like feeling angry helps them perform better in their sport. And maybe that's true for runners. I think of maybe like more aggressive sports like football or even like soccer, that might be helpful for them to achieve their optimal performance versus something like skating or ballet or even ping pong. I don't know, just thinking of examples where
like a
maybe
flow state sport more or less.
Maybe the anger isn't going to be helpful. Maybe it needs to be more of like a relaxed type situation. But every sport is different, and every person is different for how, like, do you want tense muscles? Do you want loose muscles? And even if you ask a runner running the same race, they might have a different response.
It's going to be different.
So the individualized zone of optimal functioning really helps look at what are both the pleasant and unpleasant emotions, and how much of that emotion do you want to have in order to perform your best. So this helps athletes kind of map that out for themselves and think about times when you experienced that and your performance went really well, and how can you maybe try to emulate that again. One important thing to note is you're not always going to be able to achieve that optimal zone. And so it is important to think through strategies for how you can continue to perform your best even if you aren't in that zone. But knowing the zone first, trying to get to that place when you can, and then having strategies for when you can't.
Yeah, I can definitely identify with that. It's like sometimes your brain just doesn't want to do it, and you're like, okay, I guess today is a day where it's just not going to work. Or we've all just had like that one performance or race or something where you feel okay, and then all of a sudden your brain is like, meh, not today, my friends. And we're like, okay, cool. Glad that I did all that training for this. But you know what? You just got to accept it. I always try and practice acceptance too, you know. Sometimes I go out for runs and the only rules are that we breathe and we keep our feet moving, and we can have whatever thoughts we want in our head and we just do our thing, you know.
Absolutely.
So you got to have that space. But I think it'd be good for maybe our listeners and viewers to maybe hear the process of like how you would work with someone. Maybe we can be a little bit more specific to like a runner right now, because we are on a running podcast, you know. And say that I show up to you and I'm like, hey, Nicole, guess what? I'm running the Cape Cod Marathon. You never would have guessed that. Never in a million years would anyone would have guessed that. So, and I'm just kind of looking to improve my mental game here. What would be a good starting point for someone who is just maybe as we'll say it's their first marathon. We'll say I'm signed up for this Cape Cod Marathon. It's my first marathon. What are some good like places for me to start? And obviously, if you are listening to this or watching this, please hit up Nicole if you would like some more personalized recommendations. These are just generalizations that she's going to be making. This is not a cover-all, everything fits everyone's situation, but we're just getting some general recommendations here.
Yeah,
so
awesome. Thank you for that disclaimer.
Yeah. Yes.
So typically I start with an intake and figure out what the person is hoping to achieve.
Okay.
First, in just kind of a general broad sense of, in our work together, what does success look like? What are you hoping that I can help with? You generally just said, I think, imagine it's a first-time marathoner and wanting help with the mental game. I would try and dig in a little bit more of what that means. What kind of challenges have they been facing, or are they maybe haven't faced the challenges yet, but they think that they're coming and they want to be prepared.
Hello, friends. Editing Julianna here, reporting to you from outside time and space. Woo! Unfortunately, the end of our episode with Nicole got cut off, and unsure why, but regardless, I wanted to make sure that you all got her contact information and were able to thank her for being on the show. So thank you so much, Nicole, for being on the show. If you'd like to get in contact with Nicole, you can find her on her website at NicoleJBDavies.com, and you can find her on Instagram at Dr. Nicole Davies, and on Twitter at Dr. Nicole Davies. And you can send her an email at NicoleJBDavis@gmail.com. So thank you so much to Nicole for being on the show today, and hopefully you guys all liked it. And back to the end of the episode. Thank you for listening to this episode of Run Up. This podcast is edited, hosted, and produced by me, Julianna Coughlin. Brought to you in part by the Falmouth Running Club and the Falmouth Community TV station. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on Instagram and on TikTok at runapod, and you can send us an email at runapod@gmail.com. And our original theme music was brought to you by the one and the only wonderful Jeffrey Hutton. And keep up the great work. I'm proud of you.